The dry season had come early, and with a hunger that sucked the moisture from the grasses of the high mesa prairie. What little summer rain had fallen weeks earlier baked into brittle stalks under a sun that cast the horizon into wavering heat. The usual low, soft hum of wind across the sward had sharpened into a hot, restless gust that carried with it the dry scent of tinder. Fire season, every year, was always a matter of respect. This year it was a question of survival. Captain Marcus Hale stood on the ridge overlooking the burn zone, the brim of his dust-stained hat cutting his eyes from the glare. His crew from Station 7 had been dispatched after a lightning strike lit a seam of grassland 2 days prior. The wildfire had raced along grass and brush, flicking tongues of flame over old cattle trails and threatening a scattering of isolated ranch outbuildings. The plan had been to build a control line to the west, contain the flank, and then push the head back before the wind shifted again, as it always seemed to do on the mesa. He glanced back at the operational map laid out on the hood of the command truck. Jenna Morales, the rookie crew leader with sharp instincts and an appetite for hard learning, adjusted the strap of her pack and squinted at the projected spread. Luis Vega, the veteran lookout, checked the wind flags and scooped a handful of dust, letting it fall through his fingers like sand through time. Saren Dower, a wildlife biologist temporarily embedded with them as part of an interagency ecological risk study, had joined the briefing to advise on animal movement and potential sentinels. "Ground's dry below the dry," Marcus muttered, tapping a finger on a contour line. "If that wind swings north like the model says, the fire's going to try and thread down that draw. We'll put in the line there, backburn from the old char, and push it before it can jump the next ridge." They deployed. Hand crews and engines fanned out, drip torches sparking controlled burns, and hose lines sprawled like synthetic blood vessels along the planned fire break. The open prairie offered no shadows for respite. The sun baked their faces. The smell of singed grass grew into the metallic tang that accompanied suppression operations. Beneath the surface, in the network of soil and roots they couldn't see, something older and slower stirred. The prairie's thick topsoil, a century of decomposed root mass and grasses, had, over seasons of drought, become tinder beneath tinder. In pockets along the ridge, a smoldering low-temperature ground fire had slowly ignited in the subsurface duff, fed by trapped organic matter and creeping unseen, migrating under the cover of normal ground. These were not the dramatic roaring flames above. It was a whispering subterranean combustion, advancing through the fuel-rich soil and feeding on oxygen drawn through microscopic cracks. The soil above was hot in places. It shifted subtly. Grasses browned, not from flame, but from heat seeping up from below. No one on the surface had a clear picture of that quiet threat yet. The wildfire they could see was the obvious one. The hidden fire would soon make itself known in a way they hadn't anticipated. Via a small alarm system of fur and claws, the crew's initial burn went according to plan. Lines were dug with Pulaskis, a wet line held the edge, and the backburn that Jenna set with Marcus's oversight began chewing toward the main head. The smoke from the controlled burn was thin, rising in light plumes, but the wind shifting periodically created pockets of eddying haze that confusingly masked new development. Luis's voice crackled over the radio. "Watch that saddle. Heat spike 300 meters ahead. Ground shimmer over there. Doesn't match the burn pattern." Marcus nodded, adding a slash of red to his mental map. He sent a small recon team to check the odd thermal rise. They came back with nothing definitive except for a peculiar note. A patch of grass ahead that was circumferentially yellowing in an oval, a shallow depression that made the soil feel slightly springy underfoot, and a faint smell like dried earth warmed too long. Sarah, kneeling and brushing her gloved fingers across the scorched edge, smelled something beyond charred fiber, something that hinted of slow oxidation, like the smell of a peat bog in drought. "Could be root fire," she suggested. "Underground smoldering. It can move fast beneath the surface, especially in soils with a lot of dead biomass. It doesn't have to flame to damage ground stability or preheat fuel. We should flag it." Marcus agreed to monitor, but the visible fire demanded attention. The crew pushed further along the planned line, and they began cutting the black strip to hold the flank. The sun sank lower in the day, and the sharp afternoon heat softened into a smear of orange. The crew rotated out. They weren't yet aware that below the thin skin of Prairie, the underground fire had reached a seam of decayed root mat that connected a heavily trafficked slope to a shallow burrow system of an extensive prairie dog colony, one that had survived in spite of the wildfire's approaching roar because it had adapted to the open, arid landscape. Kofi, the dominant sentinel of the prairie dog complex near the planned line, had watched the human activity with typical detached curiosity. His colony's survival depended on vigilance. Rats and hawks, coyotes and drought were regular threats. But that evening, his nose twitched to a different rhythm. The air near the burrow entrance shimmered faintly with heat. The ground under the fur of the mound gave just enough unfamiliar warmth to make his sensitive pads feel the change. He dug a little faster than usual, then stopped. The tunnel beneath him pulsed with the faint vibration of subterranean movement, the telltale slow crackle of oxidizing organic fiber, muffled but present, like a distant murmur. Kofi's small black eyes slid toward the direction of the hazard. He lifted, barked a sharp alarm, a staccato series of high-pitched yips that echoed across the colony. Within minutes, the colony was a chorus of alarmed chatter, prairie dogs popping out of burrows, tails flicking, bodies tense. They weren't yet sure of the source. To them, the earth had shifted, and the smell of hot dirt had whispered through their nostrils, a warning to be seen, heard, and felt. Above, the crew made camp for the night near the control line. They adjusted their equipment, refilled fuel, and shared a rationed meal. The sun faded, and the first stars pricked the high skies. The ground beneath their boots continued to hum its slow, deep song, unnoticed by most, registered by a few in the back of their minds as something just off, just different. The wind changed the next morning, subtle at first. It carried the smell of the wildfire with a new edge, and the air near the control line carried an undercurrent of suffocating heat. Jenna had just climbed onto the back of an engine to adjust the hose manifold when a distant crack, like the sound of an ancient branch giving way, rolled through the morning stillness. It was not the roar of the main fire, nor the snap of fuel burning. It came from the earth itself, a low, brittle pop, followed by a rumble that made the grass stand in small ripples. Luis's handheld thermal reader, held idly as he passed, spiked. Heat flare, south of the line near the old prairie dog complex, way hotter than it should be. Ground instability. Judging by the readings, something shifted. Before anyone could respond, a section of prairie dog tunnel, close to the control line and uncomfortably near a patch the crew had seeded with an inspection trench the day before, collapsed with a muffled explosion of dust and loosed soil. The collapse wasn't cosmetic. The portion of the roof of the main gallery gave way, and a fissure opened, exhaling a sudden rush of hot, smoky air. A fountain of fine, acrid particulates burst upward, carrying with it a smell of smoldering roots and earth that had never been meant to be visible. The plume took a moment to crest, then spread like a banner. Kofi, from a nearby rise, emitted a new frantic alarm. His high barks clipped and sharp, then darted away as if something's balance had shifted. An instinctive sequence of danger from the colony. The human crew, drawn by noise and the unusual thermal shock, converged. Marcus, Jenna, Luis, and Sarah arrived on the scene within moments. The collapsed tunnel revealed more than dust. From the opening came a thin, persistent thread of heat, and the air above it shimmered in waves. Sarah, without hesitation, stuck her gloved hand near the hole and pulled back. The warmth felt through the material enough to make her worry. She pulled out a small infrared probe from her pack and slid it into the cavity. The readout climbed into the 300-degree range, far hotter than surface soil should be. Below that charred pocket, a ribbon of orange smolder glowed faintly, like embers under ash, and a faint wisp of smoke, thin and unflagrantly rising, carried the stale, sweet smell of a ground fire feeding on decayed roots. Underground fire, Sarah said quietly. It's been burning beneath the prairie, rooted in old biomass, moving through the duff. That collapse exposed a conduit. It's communicating with the surface. She pointed toward the drift. Tongues of underground heat would preheat the surface grass, drying it to the point where the visible fire could flare suddenly in pockets unpredictable by the main spread model. Jenna's eyes flicked to the main head they had been pushing. The ground ahead, where they had been building the line, had thin, uneven patches of pre-browned grass that now, under the morning light, revealed faint, restless flickers, pockets where the underground fire had thinned the cap and preheated the designated safe zone. If that weakness had gone unnoticed, she muttered, and the fire jumped from below while we were still building, that line would have trapped us. The flank would have folded while the interior was compromised. Marcus issued orders immediately. Pull back the crews on the next segment. We're not anchoring there until we understand the subsurface better. Get scouts on the other side. I want to know the perimeter of this hidden fire. And mark that collapse as a warning. No one digs any deeper without a full thermal sweep. He also radioed the higher command. Hidden ground fire uncovered. Possible undermining of current line. We've got a natural alarm system in place. We're using it to map the spread. Recommend aerial thermal overflight if possible, to trace the path of the subsurface burn. The prairie dogs watched from their mounds, slowly quieting their alarm calls as the humans took in the sign. Kofi's alert had done more than save their own tunnels. It had exposed a weakness that would have become a trap. His colony, unaware of the magnitude of their contribution, squinted down into the collapsed hole and settled again into their watchful stillness. The crew did not have luxury of time. The hidden fire was not static. The collapse had opened a vent, oxygen rushing into previously smoldering pockets, and the underlying burn began to feed with a new vigor. Their thermal sweeps, guided now by the position of the tunnel collapse and Sarah's ground-penetrating hand measurements, traced a branching subsurface corridor that mirrored the networked prairie dog tunnels. The fire had exploited old root channels and compacted animal galleries, migrating sideways beneath their own constructed control line, preheating the ground in irregular patches that could have betrayed no warning until the weight of a human and the addition of flame from the main head triggered a catastrophic union. Marcus held a quick huddle. A secondary ridge, just beyond the previously planned line, was lower and would have been the fallback anchor point if the original promontory failed. But pushing the main fire to the flank from that new position would leave their best crews exposed, and the visible head was already starting to lash with small fingers of fire as winds from the east nudged it. We've got two options, Jenna said. Stick and try to reinforce the current line before it's undermined from below, which risks entrapment if this underground fire breaches into the main head, or pull out enough to re-establish on the secondary ridge and let the hidden fire burn out or be isolated with a backburn using the information we've got. Luis, looking toward the east, where a fresh gust had started to lift a curl of smoke from a distant escarpment, added, If we hold here, and that underground fire opens a pocket ahead of our line, and the wind flips, half the crew could be boxed in. We owe this one to whatever raised the alarm. We don't push into that trap. They chose to withdraw the primary crews to the secondary anchor point, using the heat maps of the underground fire to inform controlled burns that would isolate and starve the subsurface smoldering. They set small test fires along the perimeter of the hidden corridor to create a chilled buffer, tilting the visible head away from the venting zones, and reconfigured their escape and reinforcement routes accordingly. Sarah, kneeling near the collapsed tunnel, scribbled notes furiously. The prairie dog complex is literally overlaying this burn path, she said. Their burrow collapses, their alarm calls, they're showing stress points. If we can catalog their agitation with heat measurements systematically, we could build a living early warning mosaic for subterranean fire movement. She glanced at Kofi, who had drifted closer, his beady eyes watching her without blinking. Don't worry, she whispered. We'll keep you out of trouble too. The decision was also tactical. The crew set up a perimeter of lookouts, tied in redundant escape routes, and deployed a small unmanned rover with thermal imaging into the collapsed gallery, cautiously to watch for flare-ups from below. They placed wind-sensitive markers, ribbons, and passive smoke detectors, and planted manual emergency beacons, spaced, so if the fire moved faster than expectations, they could trigger automatic withdrawal. The morning turned to early afternoon with the sun high, and the ground's heat reflecting back at them like a constant pressure. The hidden fire, now vented through the collapsed tunnel, and a few other small fractures the crew had spotted, some of which were coincidentally flagged by distant, uneasy prairie dog calls, and new minor collapses of peripheral burrow roofs, began to show signs of acceleration. Pockets of methane-rich soil, dried and cracked, fed with oxygen into smoldering root mats that sporadically flared into small surface combustion hotspots, raising the hairs on their necks. Then the wind shifted, not a full reversal, but an eddying curl that set the main blaze on a violent snaking push toward the original line they had abandoned. The combination of the visible flamehead driving forward and subterranean fire spreading laterally under their former position created an ephemeral pressure, like a vice, on the crew that would have been anchoring themselves in that zone. Marcus's earlier instincts were confirmed. The fire's two modes would have trapped them between a burning ceiling of preheated grasses from below and an advancing searing wall from the visible front. They began their retreat along the pre-planned escape corridor, following the secondary ridge. Jenna led with the satellite radio beacon on, Luis swept behind, and Sarah moved with the mapping team, adjusting the lines of sight for their thermal contour markers. The burnout between the main head and the hidden underground fire began to coalesce into a narrow channel, a wedge of intensely heated air filled with swirling embers, dust, and the smell of creeping combustion. The crew felt the pressure like the breath of a living thing. Midway through the retreat, a flare from the subsurface fire erupted where the ground had been pre-weakened but not fully isolated. A small, sudden burst of flame that shot up in a column, cracking the earth. The shock of it knocked loose a spatter of burning duff that slid toward the original trench, the wind carrying a spray of ash in the crew's direction as if testing their retreat. Marcus barked a command, the radios crackled back acknowledgments, and the team accelerated, their boots pounding the dry crust, the heat at their flanks now building into a sustained wall. The hidden fire, deprived of new pathways by their controlled pre-burns and observation-based isolation, began to back down just enough to not engulf their escape route. The visible head, having momentarily surged into the space the crew had vacated, ran into the newly created black line and flared, its energy dissipated. The crew crossed the safety margin. Behind them, the two fires, one on the surface, one beneath, met in a conflagration that bloomed and then shrank, boxing its own fury into a controlled scar. Had they not retreated when they did, the pressure between the advancing wall and the subsurface venting would have tightened into an entrapment zone, with little chance of egress. They made it to the reinforced secondary anchor line, hearts hammering, lungs heaving on cold gear air. Marcus gave a terse nod. That one was close. Jenna, dusted with ash, looked back at the shimmering heat mirage where their original line had stood, now a shifting landscape of small flare-outs and smoking cracks. "We got out because something small went loud," she said, eyes scanning the direction of the prairie dog colony, where a flicker of a sentinel's tail could be seen in the heat shimmer. Containment shifted from reactionary to strategic. The hidden underground fire, now exposed and partially boxed by the crew's controlled burns and the natural barriers created by the collapse and the prairie dog activity, was given a path to burn itself out in monitored fashion. Fire crews installed long-term heat probes, and the prairie dog tunnels near the critical corridor were preserved and used as observation nodes. Sarah had rigged several inexpensive acoustic loggers in the colony periphery, correlating their alarm calls and sudden burrow roof collapses with thermal data from the ground probes. The pattern held, spikes in alert chatter preceded jumps in underground heat, and minor tunnel collapses almost always marked the edges of the subterranean spread. The crew's debrief had a sober undertone. The official report would list the technical causes, drought-dried duff, old root networks acting as fuel ladders, and the way the underground fire had connected with the main visible front to create a potential entrapment. Sandwiched into the narrative, almost as an aside, was a section titled Biological Early Warning Vector, a detailed account of how a prairie dog alarm followed by a tunnel collapse that exposed the hidden fire, provided the crucial information that prevented the crew from being trapped. Sarah's field journal, annotated with sound spectrograms of the prairie dog calls and thermal spike overlays, became required reading for nearby fire management units. Luis sat across from Kofi's mound that evening, offering a handful of dried grass in a quiet gesture. "You little sentinel," he murmured. The prairie dog, cautious but unafraid now, twitched and then, in a slow, measured movement, accepted the offering of a small seed tossed nearby. The crew erected a simple marker near the collapsed tunnel, not to exploit the animals, but to remind themselves. Here the ground spoke. Here the small ones amplified the warning. Marcus, in his follow-up briefing with Regional Command, was precise. "We build redundant systems to manage fire, but we underestimated the vertical dimension. A subterranean fire can become a ceiling and a floor simultaneously. The most actionable intelligence came from the colony. Monitor their agitation alongside thermal imaging. Incorporate that into our next training rotation." The local ranchers, who had ridden out the tense day, watching from their distant fences, came to see the scar. They stood in quiet awe, running fingers through the parched grass and peering at the collapsed tunnel, where the blackened edge of the root burn still smoldered faintly. They began to tell the story in their own way, how the little diggers had made a bigger noise than the roar of the fire, how their alarm and a piece of earth giving way had rewritten the map of risk. Months later, the burned area had become a patchwork of recovering greens and persistent char. The hidden fire's path marked a pale vein across the mesa, a reminder that what lay beneath could be as dangerous as what flamed above. Station 7 formalized a small adjunct program, Prairie Dog Awareness Training. Fire crews on incoming assignments were now given briefings that included a module titled Reading the Burrow, guidelines on how to interpret sudden prairie dog alarm calls, tunnel roof collapses, and the interplay between their behavior and subterranean heat signals. Lightweight acoustic sensors and thermal mics were sewn into modified weather stations placed near prominent colonies, and the data fused with satellite thermal imagery to create a multi-layered, low-cost early warning mesh for ground fires with an underground vector. Sarah published a short paper, Sentinels in Scales and Soil, Rodent-Altered Fire Detection in Prairie Ecosystems, detailing the ecological sensitivity of the colony and their emergent role in human safety. She insisted the paper credit the animals in the acknowledgments, not with names alone, but with a phrase, "To the prairie dog colonies whose instinctive urgency gave time to escape." The scientific community nodded, and policymakers integrated a pilot in the regional wildfire plan to respect and not disrupt prairie dog complexes during high-risk seasons. Jenna, now promoted to a crew captain in her own right, kept a small photo tucked into her field notebook. The collapsed tunnel with a faint wisp of heat rising, the crew in the background mapping, and the distant blur of a prairie dog sentinel standing guard on his mound. She used it in training sessions, tapping the corner and saying, "We plan for burn patterns, but the ground has a voice too. Listen when the small ones bark." Kofi, the original sentinel of that colony, lived out his natural span. He did not understand the awards hung on the station's bulletin boards, nor the plaque placed near the ridge that bore a modest engraving. In memory of the day, the burrow spoke. He continued his quiet patrols, shifting through the tufts of grass, sensing the rhythm of the earth, and occasionally emitting the soft, high-pitched alarms if the wind shifted and the soil trembled in a new, unfamiliar cadence. On a blistering afternoon a season later, a new crew passed through the burnt scar. The blackened skeletons of old grass glowed faintly under their boots. They paused at the marker, nodded to the preserved prairie dog colony, still buzzing softly on the far side, and made a note in their log. A distant alarm barked, sharp, staccato, echoing from a mound they had not yet noticed. The crew leader, with a half-smile, tapped the side of his radio. "Check the ground ahead. Could be something beneath the surface we don't see yet." The prairie dogs went about their endless vigilance, and somewhere below, old roots still held heat, and the land remembered the narrow line between being trapped and being freed.